Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm ready to bring you another Spinetinglers book review. And today we're going to be looking at book number 28, Circus Freaks. Now, this book has been high on my want to read list for some time, and luckily, this past go around of me wanting to pick a Spinetinglers book, I've decided to put the remaining books that I have left to review for this series into a randomizer. And lo and behold, the randomizer chose this book for me to read, and I read it for the first time ever. Given that I bought this book in a lot of Spine Tinglers books years ago, and I've always loved the cover to this. I know that this is one of the most rare kids' horror books in existence. I would classify this under the rare term known as ghost rare. You're just never going to find this book for sale, and if you do, it's going to cost you some money. um, so, given that this book is rare, given that it has an awesome cover, given that the title and the premise on the back cover sounded promising, I wanted this book to be great. And lo and behold, I was kind of shocked that I came out liking it. Not quite loving it, but liking it, which is a breath of fresh air because I think in these last few Spine Tinglers books in this series, if you don't know anything about Spine Tinglers, it was a Goosebumps knockoff trying to capitalize on the success of Goosebumps in the 1990s. And Spine Tinglers ran 30 books, which is actually one of the longest Goosebumps knockoff series ever made. And it's touted as a series written by an author known as M.T. Coffin, which is a play on the term empty coffin. But in actuality, all 30 books are ghost written and not written by an author by that name. In this book, in particular, is written by one of the big three prolific writers that you will find in this series. The big two besides this author are probably Jim DeFelice, who's known for writing like military fiction or historical fiction. And then you have Kathleen Dewey, who had a weird bibliography, to say the least, of kids' media back in the 90s. But then you had this one guy named George Edward Stanley, who's penned quite a few Spine Tinglers books, and I think he probably has the most next to Kathleen Dewey in the series. And Jim DeFelice is probably right behind him. Um, and I've read some really solid books by this author and some really bad books. So, coming out liking this book was a breath of fresh air, knowing that this actually was his final book that he wrote for this series. But like I said, I have a lot to unpack with this by the end of the video, so I'm going to kind of put a pause on this to get into the plot overview. But I will say, if you're ever fortunate enough to get your hands on a copy of this, I know this is rare. This might be worth picking up for your collection. If not for it being a trophy book, this is one of the very few circumstances where a rare kids horror book that's worth a lot of money is actually good. So you should go pick this up for your collection if you're able to. If not, I think there's a way to read it online for free, because a good friend of mine who doesn't buy these books was able to read it online. So you can probably check Archive or Anna's Archive or places like that to check this book out at your own leisure. So with that out the way, we have a book to talk about. Let's talk about Circus Freaks. We're going to run through the plot, go over some mild spoiler things within the story, but hopefully not give too much away. So the main character that you have to care about in the story is named Charles, and him and his friend Gina are really excited for a school circus that they're putting on. And in the very beginning of the story, we see that Charles and Gina have decided to dress up as quote unquote freaks for their school circus. And it may or may not involve, I think, snake costumes. And within a very, short introductory paragraph, kind of introducing the dynamics of these characters and a mild fake out, we see that the two kids are very excited to go perform at their school circus. And during the performance, everybody's having fun. And Charles and Gina can't believe that they're able to be part of something that essentially they're obsessed with, because they love circus culture and just the macabre of it. They see that their teacher, who's kind of up there in age, is doing this magnificent trapeze stunt which captivates the audience and sends the circus home on a good note. And the kids want to congratulate the teacher at the very end of the performance after everybody's going home, just to say, hey, we really loved what you did out there. But when they're finally able to talk to the teacher reveals that, hey, I know you guys love the circus lifestyle and just the atmosphere of a circus and the idea of a circus coming to our small town, which I think is called Andersonville in the story, which is, I guess, just a random name for a middle of nowhere town out somewhere in the United States, somewhere probably out in the Midwest, if I had to guess. The teacher has taken it upon herself to reach out to some traveling circuses to see if they're willing to, come through Andersonville to do an actual like professional circus for the town. And she's gotten a hit on this circus run by this guy named Mr. Ford. And she tells the students that because they're the most interested in this stuff, that she wants to take them to go to the train station, I think the following night, to essentially greet the train that's coming into town, and they get to see like all the performers get unloaded off the train, and more importantly, they get to see the star attractions of this circus, who are known as the Freaks, which the title of this book doesn't hint that to you, that this is what it's going to be about. Well, here you go. These kids are going to meet some circus freaks. And Gina and Charles, they're elated and they can't shut up about it. And Charles's parents are on board with it. And there's this whole thing where Gina is trying to get, a ride essentially with Charles to go meet up with her teacher at the train station. But, anyways, the two end up at the train station and they're watching for the specific car that's supposed to house the Freaks. And when they see this car, it has some windows and they see some shadows of beings walking inside. And off the bat, they get introduced to some very abnormal looking people. And these people, as described in the book, were, when they were in the oven, let's just say, they cooked at a different temperature or something to that effect. And when they came out, it wasn't, normal, let's just say. And Gina and Charles, they've glorified the idea of being a freak for so long that when they were introduced to some of these freaks, like there's a guy with like overly long arms that stretch down to the ground, but his legs are super short. There's a woman with like 5 foot long toes and fingers. And there's this guy who's legit a snake that sheds its skin. And in the cover, I guess is supposed to be him. I don't know if that's how he's described in the book, but yeah, that's pretty gross. And Charles and Gina, when they see these people, they realize that they look upset. They look like they are not happy being in the circus. And they put two and two together that perhaps they need to be rescued. And it's only made weirder when Charles and Gina finally get to see the star attraction, which is the Snake Man. And he doesn't seem to be in a good mood. And when they try to talk to him, he essentially says, "You need to help me," right? So when this happens, Charles and Gina, they end up talking with the Snake Man, and the Snake Man tries to give them, a quick rundown without going into too much depth. But he says that Mr. Ford, he's essentially an abusive circus ringmaster, essentially, in that all these freaks in the circus want to be freed, and they want a place where they can be themselves and not be persecuted by quote unquote normal people or be subjected to the circus lifestyle. And Charles essentially wants to save the Snake Man and his fellow comrades, but he's too tired to do so in the moment because it's 2 a.m. in the morning and him and Gina have to go home to go to bed. So his teacher offers to give him and Gina a ride home. Charles is so tired he falls asleep on the car ride back to his house, and when he comes back to his house, he bids farewell to his teacher and he heads inside to go to bed. But he's so tired that he's contemplating on like not taking a bath because he just wants to get right into bed and go to sleep. But before he does so, he opens up his window to let some fresh air in. And as he's starting to drift off to sleep, he thinks he hears a noise and something in his room. And it turns out that the Snake Man has followed him to his house and has said, okay, you're going to keep your promise, right? And Charles is like, I was thinking about it, and I think that you guys are naturally fit for the circus. You don't need my help. You are where you belong. And the Snake Man's like, no, 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 no. You need to help me. And if you don't help me and you go back on your word, I'm going to be really upset with you. And essentially, Charles takes it as like the Snake Man is going to choke him out and kill him if he doesn't help him. So Charles is like, all right, I promise that me and my friend Gina will help you guys escape. And this is a promise that Charles may or may not come to regret in the story, because after this point, he has to come to grips with Gina and say, hey, look, I might have promised these freaks that we're going to free them. And Gina's like, well, after what, thinking on it, maybe it's not the best idea, but maybe we should gather some more evidence before we decide to act on it. So they, of course, decide to go attend the circus. And they have these really good seats at the circus, and they think that this would be a good time to maybe do some spying and sleuthing behind the scenes to see if what the Snake Man has said about this Mr. Ford character perhaps is true. So when they go to the circus tent to see the freaks perform, they decide to like peek backstage, and they see some freaks that they saw earlier, but they're looking for the Snake Man, and it turns out that word of mouth has spread that he might be punished, and they find the Snake Man possibly being punished by these guards and treated inhumanely, let's just say. And in trying to, console him and get to the bottom of what's going on, they're interrupted by Mr. Ford, who's like, "What are you two doing here? You don't belong back here." And they're like, "Oh, it was a mistake." Blah 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 blah. And Mr. Ford goes on his merry way. But the Snake Man assures the kids that this guy is no joke, and if they're going to execute this plan, they're going to have to do it under the thumb of him and away from the guards, because if they have any inkling that they're going to try to escape, it's never going to happen. So from this point, after seeing what happened to the Snake Man, Charles is pretty confident that he needs to do something to help. And it's only made more clear when he gets paid another visit by the Snake Man soon after. And the Snake Man, again in his room, was hiding in there. And he's like, look, there's a town, near the, I guess, on the way out of your town, down the railroad somewhere. We need to find a way to get there. And he kind of comes up with this harebrained plan, saying that what you need to do is dress up like a freak with Gina. You need to dress up in your freak costumes, and you need to come to the loading dock when the circus is packing up. And that way you can get on the same cars as freaks, and you two can help lead us to figure out a way to get the car to this abandoned town, essentially, where there's nobody living there, but it's quiet, it's secluded, and there's enough resources for the freaks to live there peacefully, right? So Charles and Gina are like, you know what? Fine, we're in too deep, and if we go missing, our parents are never going to know what happened to us, but at least we'll know that we saved lives, I guess. So they agreed to this harebrained plan, and they go to the train station, and they decide to, enter the car full of freaks. But they had this interaction with these guards who end up putting them in cages and treating them pretty horribly. And they get to see firsthand how the freaks are being treated and how close quarters they all are, packed into this train car. But what makes matters worse is, in terms of transportation, there was a monkey wrench in the plan that the Snake Man didn't see coming, and the kids have gotten kind of separated from him. And for a few chapters, they have to figure out like where are they going to begin with. But they end up actually getting loaded on the train nonetheless, and they're in pitch black, and they hear the Snake Man nearby, and Gina and Charles have to find a way to the Snake Man to free him. And there's this really gross scene of him getting out of a cage. That was pretty gnarly. But anyways, the Snake Man finds himself out and about, and he starts to try to gather some fellow freaks. But we get a monkey wrench in the story where there's possibly more to the story that the Snake Man hasn't been giving the kids. and perhaps maybe not all the freaks want to leave. They want to run away to this town where they can, live in peace. And we see in one particular instance where this one freak perhaps is trying to put a stop to it because they might be on the side of Mr. Ford. And essentially, a climax ensues of the Snake Man and a few other freaks who have decided to band with them and listen to what the kids and the Snake Man have to say about leaving the circus. And they have to use their abilities to put a stop to one particular freak and also, combine their abilities to be able to get to the front of the engine, to be able to have enough bodies there to execute the plan of getting the train car detached from the rest of the train so they can head to their ultimate destination. And this may or may not play out for the characters in question. And once they arrive at this destination, we get a revelation of what's going to happen with the freaks moving forward, what's going to happen with Gina and Charles moving forward, albeit very rushed and quite honestly very sudden in terms of how the story wraps up with them two. But we get kind of caught up to speed with Charles in the aftermath of the story. And that's essentially all you're going to get out of this book, Circus Freaks. So, yeah, after running down the plot, let's go ahead and talk about the book here. So now we're entering the review, and I'm going to be honest about this book. I guess I'll start off with some positives here. There's one shining light I can really appreciate about this book, and that it's the premise. I think the premise is super refreshing. You just don't see a lot of circus themed kids' horror stories out there, and if they are there, most of the time they're either circumvented around clowns or there's some sort of big brain metaphor stuff going on. This is a straightforward kids go to a carnival type of story. At the heart of it, this kind of reminds me of two things from my childhood. If, let's say, somebody had a bright idea to turn these movies or episodes into a kid's horror story, there's an episode called Carnival from Malcolm in the Middle that quite literally involves the main characters there in that show interacting with a bunch of carnival freaks who are, stuck in this carnival of sorts. This reminded me of that episode. And then there was a movie that was animated from Nickelodeon called the Rugrats movie, where there's a traveling circus, whatever, and the train crashes in the middle of the woods, and there's some like circus monkeys and whatnot. That kind of gave me the same vibes going on here. And I really did appreciate that about this book. And, having the circus atmosphere, I mean, you got a good sense, at least in terms of George Edward Stanley's writing here, about what the circus was like, what kind of food people would eat, like in terms of like the patrons watching the circus. And you got a sense of where these freaks lived and all of that. It was surprisingly atmospheric, and it sucked you right into the book pretty much from the get-go. And that, stems down to these two characters that we follow in the story, Charles and Gina. Charles, being the main character, he is obsessed, and I mean obsessed with circus stuff. Maybe his friend Gina might be a little more obsessed than he is, but you get a sense that they are into the macabre and they want to be, I guess, weird. But in the story, they learn that these freaks, even though they've been glorified by these kids to be, entertainment, that perhaps that this entertainment has some human value to it, and they deserve some recognition involving humanitarianism and doing the right thing by people. And in the heart of it, these freaks that normal people deem as freaks are human on the inside, and the outside shouldn't matter. And what matters to these two kids, and these kids, mind you, they're in elementary school. So these are very young kids, and we do see some interactions with them with like high schoolers and middle schoolers in the story, but they have more emotional maturity than a good amount of the high school and middle school characters in this book, let alone in kids horror in general. So I really like Charles and Gina's journey in this story, kind of learning what it means to, accept people's differences and try to, do right by a minority group essentially. And you wouldn't think those themes and messages are in the story, but the circus theme and it being centered around these circus freaks really does work in sending those themes home. And I really did enjoy myself. And that all helped the atmosphere and the tone of the book and made it just really refreshing to read. And I really enjoyed that about it. I'm going to be upfront. This character on the cover, Snake Man, he is a conundrum in the book, and he's kind of a positive and a negative at the same time. But he has some creepy scenes where he's sneaking into Charles's room, which are easily probably the scariest points of the story, aside from this one body contortion thing he has to do in a cage near the climax of the book. This Snake Man creature, he could end up being kind of like one of those characters. He's not a villain and he's not a hero because he does threaten the kids essentially if they don't help him. But at the same time, the kids do fear him, and he doesn't make his case any better by sneaking into Charles's room a few times in the story to scare him or surprise him, I guess. He's a very ambiguous character, whether he's like evil or not. And there's points in the story where you have to question if what he's telling these kids is actually the full truth, which I think is a very cool element to it. But the Snake Man was very intriguing. I think he was way more intriguing than the actual villain of the story, which were Mr. Ford and his guards. But I will say, given what we were given with those characters, although I wish we had more, there is some legitimacy behind what the Snake Man is saying, and it does make you think about the treatment of people in the entertainment industry and what have you in regards to Snake Man. But nonetheless, I really enjoyed the Snake Man character. And yeah, in terms of writing, I've read quite a few George Edward Stanley books. I've seen some books where he has jarring paragraph transitions and kind of sloppy, meandering writing. I've seen books where he just misses the mark completely. And then I've read books where he's essentially writing a movie in motion. I would say that this is probably his closest replication to actual kids' horror that I've seen, maybe next to Billy Baker's Dog Won't Stay Buried. But ironically, after reading this book makes me appreciate Billy Baker's Dog Won't Stay Buried in a whole different light than I did before. But in terms of like his outings in Spinetinglers that I've read, this is one of his better ones in terms of his writing ability. And there's some pretty decent prouse to go along with the atmosphere of the story, and some pretty decent monologue here and there with Charles when he's not obsessing about circus stuff and helping the Snake Man in the story. So yeah, a lot of solid positives, but I feel like we have to get into some negatives now, unfortunately. And I'm going to say this: I do have quite a few here, sadly. And I guess I'll start here because this is probably one of the more pronounced negatives I have with the book. In my opinion, I've raved about this book and I've said a lot of praises about it, but if I'm being honest, for this book being 118 pages, you wouldn't think that it needs to be shorter, but this is one of those books, kind of like Attack of the Jack-o'-lanterns to me, where this could have been a 60-page short story and it did not need to be this length. Because there's a portion, I guess the middle stretch of the book, it does get very repetitive in terms of the monologue writing and the dialogue of the characters constantly talking about freeing these circus freaks over and over and over again. And I don't know if that is George Edward Stanley not respecting the intelligence of kids reading these books or what, but that ate out a lot of the mid portion of this book. And to be honest, by the time you get to the back half and the climax where the kids finally show up to the train station to help the freaks, you would think that the story would kick on in terms of that, but it never really does fully click on. And we're kind of getting into my second negative here now. I don't really feel like this book had a real climax. Like, it just felt like we arrived to this point and there's obvious things to be had at this point where there's these characters dressed up as freaks are now going to be intermingling with the actual freaks in tow on the train. And of course, there's going to be some power dynamics and some power struggles there, but it never evolves from that. You would think that there would be an actual climax with the villain, Mr. Ford, and the guards trying to put a stop to these freaks from escaping. None of that ever happens. It just never happens. It just, these characters never really have any sort of adversal threat going on in the back half of the story, which plays into my third negative as well, kind of here. There's an aspect introduced in like the last third of the book involving the Snake Man, where he's kind of an ambiguous character. Like, can you trust him? Because some of the freaks that are in the train car, I guess corroborating what the Snake Man has said, is actually going against what he's said to these kids. And not all the freaks want to be freed. Some of them actually want to stay with the circus. Some of them don't want to have this new life. And the book never really goes into the Snake Man and what exactly is going on with that. Better yet, now we're getting into a fourth negative. These freaks, right? Their origin about how they are the way they are is like a blink and you miss it type of thing. But they were implied to be just, standard carnival freaks at one point. But at some point, going through, I guess, a circus tour, they ended up in like a town with like radioactive water. They drank the water and turned into actual monsters. So all of these people, these freaks in the circus, are actual monsters according to this book. And Mr. Ford is the wrangler of them, and obviously he's the one profiting off them and showcasing them to the masses to make money off of. You would think that maybe the kids would have some actual stakes involving that. Maybe they would be taken by Mr. Ford and threatened to drink this radioactive water to become actual freaks like their costumes or something. But none of that potential is used in the story. And that just kind of feeds into the letdown of it all, because like I wanted to see more exploration into some of these freak characters and maybe who they were before they joined the circus and maybe dabble into that, but it just never explores that. And the book is just one note because of it, which is my last negative. If I've already said that this book is repetitious and it's constantly drilling home the fact that these kids need to save the circus freaks and what have you, that's literally all this book is. We don't really ever get to know Charles and Gina on a deeper level. I mean, their monologue is decent at times, but they're so gung ho about circus things and saving these creatures, I guess monsters in the circus, that the story never evolves from that point, and it just gets old to the point where, you kind of see through the cracks of the story and all you see is wasted potential going on in the book. And to me, while it's not the most insufferable thing ever, that really let me down in reading this book, because I wanted the story to kind of evolve into what Stanley's known for doing in creating an actual movie. And it just became like a book, biding its time to get to that eventual point. I guess we're getting back onto the it dragging and it not needing to be a 118 page book. It only needed to be a 60 page short story essentially. But like I said, I mean, this book needed some tweaking for me to like full on love it, sadly. But with those things being said, I did really like it. And honestly, I would give this book a good rating, which for me, on a kids' horror books basis, since I, give a 1 point curve off the top for everything kids' horror, since it's made for kids, I was willing to give this between a 3.5 to a 3.9, which is a good, or maybe like a fine / good. So yeah, that has a lot of weight to that when I say that. What I ended up given all the negatives I have with the book, I had some smallish to medium ones that kind of added up, but nothing too detrimental here. Collectively, I decided to deduct maybe like 1.3 points off the top, and I gave this book a 3.7 out of 5. This is an average kids horror book, about as average as you can get, but it's a good average, and that to me is what you should aim for in kids horror. When I say average, I mean good. And that's all you can really ask for sometimes. And some people might get caught up on a letter grade here and there, because for me this is a C. But remember, if you've ever been to college, C's get degrees, y'all. This is a good book. Go check this out. If you're able to read it online for free, go check it out. If you find this in your local bookstores for cheap, definitely pick it up. This is a ghost rare book. It's super hard to get your hands on in terms of collecting. And I don't think many people would actually be all that disappointed with it. It has some vibes to, classic golden age kids horror like Are You Afraid of the Dark? This feels like a shoe into that show in some aspects, and I think a lot of people would get a kick out of that. And yeah, it gets a recommend for me. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Circus Freaks. Let me know down in the comment section if you've read this book before. Do you love this? Do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.